Imagine you are standing in the city of Luoyang in the year 180 AD. You are in the heart of the Han Dynasty, the most advanced civilization on Earth. Around you, the imperial palace complex stretches across 1,000 acres. You see the Grand Canal carrying trade goods from the furthest reaches of the empire. You see paper being manufactured in massive workshops. Paper, a technology Europe won't discover for another 1,000 years. You see civil servants selected through competitive examinations based purely on merit, not bloodline. You are standing in a society that has lasted 400 years, that controls 60 million people, that has invented the seismograph, the wheelbarrow, and the blast furnace. This is the pinnacle of human organization. If you walked up to a Han bureaucrat, one of the educated administrators who keeps this vast machine running, and told him that in just 40 years this entire system would collapse into warlord chaos, that the dynasty would fragment into competing kingdoms, that millions would die in civil war, that this 400-year-old system of governance would simply cease to exist, he would look at you with pity. He would call you ignorant. The Han Dynasty is eternal. The examinations ensure only the best minds govern. The mandate of heaven protects the righteous. The system is too sophisticated to fail. Now travel forward 1,800 years. Stand in Washington, D.C. in the year 2025. Look at the Capitol building. Look at the Pentagon. Look at the federal agencies, staffed by thousands of credentialed experts with PhDs from the finest universities. Look at the aircraft carriers patrolling every ocean. Look at the GDP numbers that dwarf every other nation combined. If I told you that by the year 2026, the mathematical foundation of this American system would reach an unsustainable breaking point, that the same fatal mistake that destroyed the Han Dynasty is now locked into our trajectory, that we are 40 years into the exact same death spiral, you would have the exact same reaction as that Han bureaucrat. You would say the system is too big, too advanced, too sophisticated to fail. But here's what that Han bureaucrat didn't understand. And here's what we refuse to understand today. Sophistication doesn't prevent collapse. It often accelerates it. Because complex systems fail in complex ways. And when you build your entire civilization on a foundation that violates basic mathematical reality, it doesn't matter how many PhDs you have. It doesn't matter how advanced your technology is. The math eventually wins. And when it wins, the collapse is not gradual. It is sudden, it is brutal, and it is total. History is not a collection of random events. It is a pattern recognition system. It is the same play performed on different stages with different actors wearing different costumes. But the plot never changes, because human nature never changes. The incentives that drive rulers to make fatal mistakes are the same in 180 AD as they are in 2025 AD. The Han Dynasty made one specific mistake, one choice that seemed reasonable in the moment, one policy that looked like an elegant solution to a short-term problem. But that one mistake created a cascading system failure that became mathematically irreversible. And when the math became impossible, the dynasty didn't reform. It didn't adapt. It collapsed. The United States of America is not unique. We are not special. We are not exempt from the laws of economic gravity that have destroyed every empire before us. And right now in 2025, we are repeating the exact mistake the Han Dynasty made. Not a similar mistake. The exact mistake. The same mechanism, the same incentive structure, the same mathematical impossibility, building toward the same inevitable conclusion. This video is going to show you three things. First, what the Han Dynasty was at its peak and what made it great. Second, the precise mistake they made and the timeline of how it destroyed them. And third, how America has not only repeated that mistake, but has done it faster and at a scale that makes the Han collapse look gentle by comparison. The year 2026 marks 250 years since American independence, and 250 years is the historical average lifespan of a dominant civilization before catastrophic reset. This is not prophecy. This is pattern recognition. The cycle is real. The timeline is real. And the math is undeniable. Pay close attention to what comes next, because understanding this pattern is the difference between being crushed by history and seeing it coming in time to prepare. To understand the end, we must understand the beginning. The Han Dynasty was not always corrupt. In fact, it began as one of the most merit-based, efficiently governed societies in human history. The dynasty was founded in 206 BC after the collapse of the brutal Qin dynasty. Emperor Gaozu, the founder, was not born into nobility. He was a peasant who rose through military leadership. This set the tone. The early Han Dynasty was built on a radical idea. Land should be distributed relatively equally, and tax burden should be shared fairly across all classes. The early emperors implemented what historians call the equal field system. When the dynasty began, they conducted a massive land redistribution. Large estates owned by aristocrats were broken up. Land was distributed to peasant farmers. Each family received enough land to sustain itself. In exchange, these families paid a relatively light tax to the central government, usually around 10 to 15% of their harvest. This created a stable economic foundation. Millions of small landholding farmers formed the tax base. They produced food. They paid taxes. They provided conscripts for the army when needed. This was sustainable because the burden was distributed. No single class was crushed by taxation, while others escaped it. The Han Dynasty also pioneered the civil service examination system. Government positions were not inherited. They were earned through competitive testing on Confucian classics, history, and administration. This meant the bureaucracy was staffed by the most educated and capable individuals, regardless of birth. It was a meritocracy. This combination of broad-based land ownership, fair taxation, and meritocratic governance created something remarkable. The Han Dynasty presided over a golden age. Population exploded from 20 million to 60 million. Agriculture flourished. The Silk Road opened trade with Rome. Technology advanced faster than anywhere else on Earth. The dynasty was wealthy, stable, and powerful. But here's the thing about success. It creates the conditions for its own destruction. Because when a system becomes wealthy, new incentives emerge. The people who benefit most from the system begin to ask a question that will eventually destroy it. Why should I pay taxes when I'm rich enough to avoid them? As the Han Dynasty expanded, costs exploded. This is the pattern every empire follows. Success demands more resources to maintain. The dynasty pushed into Central Asia, fighting the Xiongnu nomads. They established military garrisons thousands of miles from the capital. They built and maintained the Great Wall. They funded the Silk Road trade infrastructure. They supported a growing bureaucracy administering 60 million people across territory the size of modern China. All of this cost enormous amounts of money, and that money had to come from taxes. But here's where the problem emerged. As the Han Dynasty matured, as wealth accumulated, as powerful families grew richer across generations, a class structure solidified. The wealthy landowners, the merchant families, the military generals who had been rewarded with land grants. They became an aristocracy. And aristocracies have one universal trait. They believe they deserve special privileges. By the year 100 AD, roughly 100 years into the dynasty, the Han emperors faced a problem every emperor eventually faces. The empire's expenses exceeded its tax revenue. There was a deficit. The budget didn't balance. Something had to change. An emperor in this position has two choices. Both are politically painful. Choice one, you can cut spending. This means reducing the military, which makes the empire vulnerable to barbarian invasion. Or it means cutting the civil service, which makes the empire harder to govern. Or it means reducing public works like roads and canals, which makes the economy less efficient. All of these make powerful people angry and make the empire weaker. Choice two, you can raise taxes. But here's the problem. You can raise taxes on the peasants, the small farmers who form the backbone of the empire. But they're already near subsistence level. Push them harder and they starve or revolt. Or you can raise taxes on the wealthy landowners and merchants. But they are politically powerful. They have connections to court officials. They fund the emperor's projects. They are often the families of generals and administrators. Taxing them risks a political backlash or even a coup. So emperors across history face this impossible choice. The hard decisions that would solve the problem are politically impossible. But there's a third option, an easy option. An option that seems elegant in the moment but creates catastrophe decades later. The option the Han Dynasty chose, the fatal mistake. They allowed the wealthy to avoid taxes while extracting more from everyone else. This is the mechanism of collapse. This is where the Han Dynasty made the choice that would destroy them. And this is exactly where we are right now. Pay very close attention because the parallels are not vague. They are precise. Starting around the year 100 AD, Han emperors began granting tax exemptions to powerful families. If you were connected to the imperial court, if you had served as a general, if you came from an aristocratic family, you could register your land under special status that made it tax exempt. Or more commonly, you could simply bribe local officials to look the other way when tax collectors came. Here's how the scam worked. Let's say you're a wealthy landowner who owns 10,000 acres. Under the law, you owe taxes on all of it. But you donate some of your land to a local temple, which is tax exempt. Except you still control the temple. You still profit from the land. You've just moved it into a tax shelter, or you split your land among multiple family members, each registering small plots that technically stay under the tax exemption threshold. Or you simply pay off the local tax assessor to report your land as less productive than it actually is. The tax code became a maze of loopholes, exemptions, and special categories, and the only people who could navigate this maze were the wealthy, the only people who could hire scribes and lawyers to structure their assets, the only people who could bribe officials. Meanwhile, the small farmers, the people who owned 10 or 20 acres and worked it themselves, had no such options. They paid the full tax burden. And as the wealthy avoided more and more taxes, the revenue shortfall grew. So the government had to squeeze the remaining taxpayers harder to make up the difference. Tax rates on the peasant farmers crept up. 15% became 20%, then 25%, then 30% or more. But here's where the math becomes impossible. As taxes on small farmers increased, many couldn't pay. When you can't pay your taxes, the government seizes your land. But who buys that seized land? The wealthy landowners who weren't paying taxes in the first place. They bought the foreclosed land at bargain prices, added it to their tax-exempt estates, and removed even more land from the tax base. This created a death spiral. More land concentrated in fewer hands, more land became tax-exempt. The tax base shrank. The remaining taxpayers faced higher burdens. More farmers defaulted. More land was seized and added to tax-exempt estates. And the cycle repeated. By the year 150 AD, about 50% of the arable land in the Han Dynasty was owned by just 1% of the population. And most of that land paid little to no taxes. The system that had begun with broad-based land distribution and fair taxation had become a feudal structure where the wealthy controlled everything and contributed nothing. The emperors knew this was happening. Court officials wrote memorials warning that the tax system was breaking down. But fixing it would require confronting the most powerful people in the empire. It would require closing loopholes. It would require enforcing tax collection on the wealthy. And no emperor had the political will to do it. Because the wealthy families were often the same families who staffed the government, who commanded the armies, who had the power to overthrow an emperor who threatened their interests. So the emperors did nothing. They kept squeezing the peasants. They kept borrowing money. They kept pretending the system could continue. And the mathematical reality kept building pressure like a fault line storing energy before an earthquake. The collapse didn't happen overnight, but when it came fast. Let me show you the timeline. By the year 160 AD, the Han Dynasty was in deep crisis. The government was functionally broke. Tax revenue had collapsed because so much wealth was hidden in tax shelters. The military was underfunded. Soldiers on the frontier weren't being paid. Infrastructure was crumbling because there was no money to maintain it. The peasant farmers, crushed by impossible tax burdens, began abandoning their land. Millions became refugees, landless and desperate. They had worked their entire lives, and the system had taken everything. Their land was gone. Their savings were gone. They had nothing left to lose. This created the conditions for revolution. In the year 184 AD, a massive peasant uprising called the Yellow Turban Rebellion exploded across the empire. Over 360,000 peasants took up arms against the government. Their message was simple. The system is rigged, the wealthy don't pay, we're being crushed, and we're not going to take it anymore. The Han government tried to suppress the rebellion, but here's the problem. They couldn't pay their soldiers. The military was fragmented. Generals had to pay their own troops, which made the generals more powerful than the emperor. Power decentralized. The empire broke into competing factions. By the year 220 AD, just 40 years after the Yellow Turban Rebellion, the Han Dynasty ceased to exist. It fragmented into 3 competing kingdoms. The period that followed, called the Three Kingdoms period, saw constant warfare. An estimated 40 million people died. Not from the initial rebellion, but from the chaos and warfare that followed the collapse of central authority. What destroyed the Han Dynasty? Not the barbarians at the gates, not a foreign invasion, not a natural disaster. What destroyed the Han Dynasty was the tax system. Specifically, the decision to allow the wealthy to avoid taxes while crushing everyone else. That one policy choice created a mathematical impossibility. You cannot run an empire when your tax base evaporates. You cannot maintain armies and infrastructure when only the poorest citizens are paying. And you cannot maintain political legitimacy when the system is visibly rigged in favor of the wealthy. When the peasants realized they were carrying the entire burden while the wealthy contributed nothing, trust in the system collapsed. And when trust collapsed, the dynasty collapsed. Now let's turn that mirror toward ourselves. Let's look at the United States of America in the year 2025. And let's be very clear about what we're going to see. We are not approaching the Han Dynasty's mistake. We are deep inside it. We have already made the choice. We are decades into the death spiral. And the math is approaching the breaking point. Just like the Han Dynasty, America began with a relatively broad distribution of wealth and a progressive tax system designed to share the burden fairly. After World War II, the top marginal tax rate in the United States was 91%. The wealthy paid taxes. The system was funded. Infrastructure was built. The middle class exploded. But just like the Han Dynasty, as America became wealthy, as certain families accumulated massive fortunes, as corporations became more powerful than governments, the tax code began to evolve. It became complex, filled with loopholes, special exemptions, deductions, tax shelters. And just like the Han Dynasty, the only people who can navigate this complexity are the wealthy. Let me show you the numbers. Because the parallels are not vague. In 1980, the top 1% of Americans controlled about 8% of the nation's wealth. Today, they control 32%. That's a level of concentration not seen since the Gilded Age, not seen since right before the Great Depression, and approaching the levels that destroyed the Han Dynasty. But here's the critical part. As wealth has concentrated, tax burden has shifted. In 2021, ProPublica obtained IRS data showing that the 25 wealthiest Americans paid an average true tax rate of just 3.4% of their wealth growth. Jeff Bezos, in some years, paid 0 federal income tax. Elon Musk, 0. Warren Buffett has openly stated that he pays a lower tax rate than his secretary. How is this possible? The same way it was possible in the Han Dynasty. Tax shelters. The wealthy don't take taxable income. They take stock options. They borrow against their assets. They route money through foundations and trusts. They move profits to countries with lower tax rates. They hire armies of accountants and lawyers to structure their finances in ways that are technically legal but completely contrary to the spirit of the tax code. Meanwhile, who pays? The middle class? The people who earn wages, who can't hire tax attorneys, who can't move their income to the Cayman Islands, who can't take advantage of the carried interest loophole or the stepped-up basis or the dozens of other mechanisms available only to the wealthy. The numbers are clear. In 1960, corporations paid 23% of federal tax revenue. Today, they pay about 7%. The shortfall had to be made up somewhere. It was made up by increasing payroll taxes, Social Security taxes, state and local taxes, all the taxes that hit the middle and working class hardest. Just like the Han Dynasty peasant farmers, the American middle class is carrying an increasing share of the burden while the wealthy contribute less and less. And just like the Han Dynasty, this creates a death spiral. As the wealthy pay less, the deficit grows. The government borrows more, the debt increases. Currently, the U.S. national debt is over $36 trillion. That's more than 120% of GDP. Interest payments on that debt are approaching $1 trillion per year. That's more than the defense budget. To pay these interest payments, the government has 2 choices. Cut spending, which is politically impossible, or raise taxes. But raising taxes on the wealthy is politically blocked by the influence of wealth on the political system. Campaign contributions, lobbying, the revolving door between corporate boardrooms and government positions. The wealthy have captured the political system the same way wealthy landowners captured the Han Dynasty court. So instead, the government borrows more and prints money. And the cycle continues. But here's the thing about mathematical impossibilities. They don't care about politics. They don't care about excuses. Eventually, the math wins. We are approaching the point where the math wins. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2030, interest payments on the debt will exceed all discretionary spending combined. That means every dollar of tax revenue will go to interest payments, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. There will be nothing left for the military, nothing for infrastructure, nothing for education, nothing for anything else. At that point, the government has 3 choices: default on the debt, print massive amounts of money causing hyperinflation, or implement crushing austerity that triggers social breakdown. None of these options are good. All of them lead to systemic crisis. Just like the Han Dynasty in the decades before collapse, we are seeing the early signs of trust breakdown. The social contract is fraying. A 2024 Gallup poll showed that only 18% of Americans trust the federal government to do what is right. That's near historic lows. Trust in Congress is at 11%. Trust in the Supreme Court has collapsed. Trust in media is below 30%. These are not just bad poll numbers. These are the warning signs that the system is losing legitimacy. And we're seeing the same dynamic that preceded the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Millions of Americans, particularly younger generations, are looking at the system and realizing it's rigged. They're working multiple jobs and can't afford housing. They're buried in student debt while billionaires pay 0 taxes. They're watching infrastructure crumble while the stock market hits record highs. The wealth gap is not just a number, it's a lived experience. And when people experience a system as fundamentally unfair, when they see the wealthy avoiding the burdens everyone else carries, trust evaporates. In the Han Dynasty, that trust collapse led to the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 AD. In America, we're seeing increasing social unrest, political polarization at levels not seen since the Civil War, rising support for radical political movements on both the left and right, violence at protests, armed standoffs with federal authorities. These are not random events. These are symptoms of a system under mathematical and social pressure that it cannot sustain. Here's where we come back to the timeline. And here's why 2026 matters. Sir John Glubb, a British historian who studied the life cycles of empires, found that great civilizations last an average of 250 years. The Assyrians, the Persians, the Romans, the Ottomans, the British, they all followed roughly the same lifespan. They go through predictable stages: Pioneers, conquest, commerce, affluence, intellect, decadence, decline. The final stage, decadence and decline, is marked by several characteristics: massive debt, wealth inequality, tax systems that favor the rich, a welfare state that creates dependency, internal division, weakening of shared values, loss of trust in institutions. Does this sound familiar? The United States declared independence in 1776. Add 250 years. You get 2026. We are mathematically at the historical average lifespan of a dominant civilization. Now, this doesn't mean the country ceases to exist on January 1st, 2026. The Han Dynasty didn't disappear the day after its 250th year. But what history shows is that empires that reach this point without reforming enter a crisis phase. A period where the accumulated contradictions of the system become unsustainable, where the math catches up, where trust collapses, where the social contract breaks. For the Han Dynasty, that crisis phase was the period from 184 AD to 220 AD, 36 years of collapse. For America, we may already be in the early stages of that crisis phase: the 2008 financial crisis, the political breakdown after 2016, the pandemic response, the inflation spike of 2021-2022, the January 6th riot. These are not isolated incidents. These are pressure points where the system nearly broke. The year 2026 is not the collapse, it's the marker. The point where the historical pattern says systems that reach this point without fundamental reform don't make it to 300 years. They reset, sometimes violently, sometimes gradually, but they reset. When the Han Dynasty collapsed, it wasn't the end of China. Chinese civilization survived. Eventually, new dynasties emerged, but the structure that had existed for 400 years was gone. The comfort, the stability, the institutions, all destroyed. And the people who were most dependent on that system, who had tied their entire wealth and identity to it, were crushed. The people who survived and even thrived during the collapse were those who saw it coming, who understood that when the tax base evaporates, when the wealthy avoid all obligations while the masses are crushed, the system becomes mathematically impossible, who positioned themselves accordingly. They held real assets, land that produced food, skills that were valuable in any system, gold and silver that held value when the currency collapsed. They built networks of trust outside the official system. They moved to regions less affected by central government breakdown. They prepared. Right now, we are standing where a Han Dynasty citizen stood in the year 180 AD. We can see the cracks in the foundation if we're willing to look. The math is impossible. The tax system is rigged. The deficit is unsustainable. The wealth concentration is extreme. Trust is collapsing. The social contract is breaking. We cannot stop the cycle. It's bigger than any of us. It's bigger than any politician or any policy. The incentives that drive this pattern are baked into human nature. Rulers will always take the easy path. The wealthy will always use their power to avoid obligations. The system will always concentrate wealth until the math breaks. But we can learn from history. We can refuse to be like that Han bureaucrat who dismissed the warning because the system seemed too sophisticated to fail. We can open our eyes to the pattern that is played out a dozen times across history. We can see that sophistication doesn't prevent collapse. It often accelerates it. The fatal mistake has been made. The tax base is evaporating. The wealthy are avoiding their obligations. The middle class is being crushed. The deficit is exploding. The timeline says we're at the 250-year mark where systems enter crisis. The only question is what you're going to do with this knowledge. Are you going to keep pretending the system can continue forever? Or are you going to look at history, recognize the pattern, and prepare for what comes next? The cycle is real. The pattern is documented. The math is impossible. And the clock is ticking toward 2026. The Han Dynasty fell because the wealthy avoided taxes while everyone else was crushed. America is repeating the exact same mistake. Not a similar mistake. The exact mistake. The same mechanism, the same incentives, the same mathematical impossibility building toward the same inevitable breaking point. History is screaming at us across 800 years. The question is whether we're listening or whether we're going to learn this lesson the hard way like every empire before us. The final act has begun. The earthquake is building pressure, and those who understand the pattern will not be surprised when the ground finally shifts. The warning has been delivered. What happens next is up to you.